Hey everyone, my name is Hackney. I'm a Techno and House music DJ and producer, and in this video I'm going to be discussing my time spent studying music production at BIMM London. So yeah, I've recently finished studying a BA Honours degree in music production at BIMM London in Fulham. I graduated with a 2-1 and I wanted to share some of my thoughts on BIMM itself. I'll be talking about the good points, the bad points, and whether it's worth your time studying at BIMM. First of all, some context about myself and where I've sort of come from. I moved from rural England in Somerset in the southwest and moved up to London specifically to study. Like so many other people, I saw London as the place to be for music in the UK. I did consider Bristol as it was a lot closer to where I used to live, but ultimately the allure of living and studying in London was the deciding factor. Now, I produce electronic music and my skills lie in sequencing and programming music using MIDI and synthesizers. I had a bit of experience with microphones before, but not necessarily running a studio session for a band or being a live sound engineer at a gig. I was slightly hesitant when starting my course as I felt like I might have been a bit of a black sheep coming from a more electronic music background. Not just on my course specifically, but throughout BIMM London itself, as all of the other courses tend to be based around more singers and songwriters, being a musician or being sort of with the music business, not necessarily something you associate with electronic music production. But anyway, let's get into the main part of this video and I'll start dissecting my degree. So in England and probably the UK, the first year of university doesn't actually count towards your final grade. I don't know about other universities, but my university definitely felt like the first year was there to get everyone on a very sort of similar level before diving deeper into the more technical aspects of music production, you know, things like setting up and running PA systems, creating synthesizers or planning career paths. So yeah, these were the modules for my first year of university. So the first one was audio theory. It was good to learn the fundamentals of sound and how they sort of work within a studio space. For the assessment, we had to design and plan a studio build, which meant we had to research a lot of studio gear, which was a lot of fun, but then also research how to build stud walls and how to fill them with rock wool for sound insulation. Not really what I had in mind for studying a music production degree, but it was quite a lot of fun nonetheless. Now, studio engineering and mixing and arrangement were kind of linked. Studio engineering was learning the basics of microphones, running a studio, recording, and then mixing and arrangement was learning how to produce what we had just recorded. Pro Tools was heavily pushed throughout these two modules, with it being sort of the industry standard when it comes to recording and running music sessions. I already had a basic understanding of how to use a mixing desk, microphones and stuff like this from college, as I studied music production at college as well. But also I knew sort of a bit of how to mix music through my own music that I'd studied previously, both doing stuff at home by myself on running FL Studio or using the mixing desk and microphones from college as well. The same sort of thing can be said for computer music production. Having spent a lot of my own time plus 2 years at college learning about DAWs, VST synthesizers, plugins and all this sort of stuff. So a lot of this module, you know, computer music production, I'd already sort of learnt about. So it was just going over stuff I already knew. Now, music business was a bit of a weird one. At the time, I didn't have much interest in the module. We were learning about copyright, PRS, you know, music labels, all sorts of stuff, all quite dry subjects like this. But at the time, back in 2017 and 2018, I was just a bedroom producer, you know, who just wanted to make cool sounding music really, which I didn't think all of this stuff about royalties, copyright, licensing, I didn't think any of that was particularly relevant to what I was doing at the time, which is a shame now because as someone who is releasing music independently, all of this stuff would have been quite useful to know, but unfortunately, I just can't really remember any of it all. Now, lastly, in creative sounds, we were looking at sort of non-musical music, if you sort of know what I mean. Things like drone music, ambient textures, audio-visual installations. Generally quite interesting stuff, which gave me a sort of unique perspective on my own music. So then overall, for the first year, I felt that it was quite easy. Definitely not really worth my £6,000 that I paid in a tuition fee. But as I said, it felt like the first year was more about getting everyone on the same page and going over the basics of music production in case anyone hadn't covered that particular area. You know, like using a mixing desk or working with synthesizers. This is all well and good, but considering this was a degree level course, I was hoping to be challenged a bit more. And also, surely you're going to university if you already have a basic knowledge and understanding of your chosen area. You shouldn't need to be taught the basics if you're starting a degree. The basics should already be there, and then you go to university to advance your knowledge and hopefully start and build a career. This was my approach anyway, but obviously not everyone is the same at BIMM, and obviously BIMM itself is a business business at the end of the day and needs to make money. So it makes sense that the entry bar is reasonably low, so they don't put people off that just have a basic interest or basic understanding of music itself. But there was still 2 more years to go, and I was hoping and assuming that the level of work would increase and challenge me a lot more. The second year is where things start to get a little bit more serious. The work done here counted towards my final mark at the end of my final year. We'll start with live sound production. This was one of my optional modules. It was either studying this or computer music performance. Now, being a DJ myself, computer music performance probably made a little bit more sense from that point of view. Working with Ableton, using a push controller to create a live performance. But in terms of practicality, learning how to set up and run a PA system for a gig would be better whenever looking for a job, as using a push controller and learning Ableton for a live performance is quite a niche thing. It was a very hands-on module, as we were setting up and running a PA system every week, bringing out the floor monitors for the band and using some EQ and some compression to make the sound better in a particular room that we were using, because obviously every room has its own acoustics. And you need to, especially if you're running a gig for a live sound, you want that loud sound to be sounding as good as possible. This is all very good practical knowledge, and I'm very glad I chose this module over the computer music performance, and this really is reflected in the mark that I got for this module. Now, music production industry was very similar to music business in the first year. It was quite a dry academic module that had little to no relevance to what I was doing at the time in terms of my music, just being a bedroom producer. But once again, the stuff here could be quite useful now that I'm releasing my own music independently. We learned about how to release music as a music producer, potential revenue streams that you can investigate, and a little bit about marketing as well. It did feel like a step up from music business in the first year in terms of relevancy and interest from myself. But again, ultimately, it wasn't one of my preferred subjects at the time, and I unfortunately remember very little of it. Music production, in contrast, was a very interesting subject, as we learnt about the history, the culture, and the impacts on society that music production and music technology had, as well as look into the future and potential new technologies, new prospects for what it is to be a music producer. This module was quite a memorable one, as we had to do a 4,000 words, I think it was about 4,000 words, research paper into a topic related to music production. Now, I did mine on the impact of the Roland TR-909 and the TB-303 and what effect that had on creating the genre of techno. So I was looking at the original Belleville 3 from Detroit, sort of acid house, the illegal raves that were happening all over Europe at the time, back in the 80s and 90s. I really enjoyed doing this module overall, and felt like I really got something out of it. It's always good to know sort of the background behind your area of interest. Sound studio production followed on from my first year of studio engineering, just taking the basics of microphones and using a mixing desk and then applying that to running a session for a band. It was a very practical unit and one I did enjoy quite a lot, but I didn't really see myself going into this area of work once I'd graduated. The module itself was good, and I learned some good tricks to do with sort of, mic placements, using a patch bay and running a studio myself. But as someone wanting to go into the realm of electronic music, in my head this module didn't really rank particularly highly on my list of priorities. Sound for Moving Image was probably one of my favourite modules over the whole 3 years. This was partly due to the tutor that I had, a guy called Marios Aristopoulos. I know I'm not saying that right, but he had a substantial CV, ranging from things like film scoring, music for video games, which he had actually won awards for, and also he was teaching in both London and New York at different universities. Also, I studied media production at college, so I already had quite a good understanding of how to actually create a film, more from the visuals point of view, but I hadn't studied sort of film scoring, creating sound for a moving image. So it was nice to sort of learn and put sort of two skills together. And the module itself was super interesting. It was a very different approach to making music and a very different way to use a DAW. I learned some cool tools in Logic that I didn't know about before, and it was really cool seeing how to use those and how I can then apply those to my own music. Specifically the MIDI humanization tool, which is great for if you're using a digital orchestra or a VST orchestra sounds and you want to make them sound more human with a slight variation in things like velocity and the timing of the notes. And then you sort of using things like this that I can then apply to my own music, for example, my own percussion in the songs that I make. It's these cool little tricks that you learn from elsewhere that you can apply to your own music, which then make your music more unique. Now lastly was Computer Music Production 2. This was a big step up from the first year, and we were finally starting to learn some of the deeper aspects of synthesis, the use of effects and mastering as well. The highlight of this module was the final assessment, where we had to use either Native Instruments, Reactor or Max for Live, where we had to create our own synthesizer or a plugin to use in a track. Now my track that I've released on my EP, Monkey Resonance, it features a flanger effect and a synthesizer. Now both of those effects I built specifically for this assessment. The white noise sound that you can hear at the beginning with the arpeggiator, that came from the synthesizer that I had to build. Now this was much more what I came to university for, to learn these new technologies, these new production techniques that I could apply to my own work. This was much more what I was looking for and hoping to see in my first year, but ultimately I had to wait a year before I could see all of this sort of stuff. Now, to summarise year 2, this certainly was a big step up and a step in the right direction as well compared to the previous year. I did some good work this year, I felt, and it definitely challenged me in some places to do a significant amount of research into some history or into a new piece of software. Although I felt like this year should have been my first year, and I could have spent an extra year on the course learning more aspects to music production, because there were just simply so many things to learn. And a 3-year course, you could easily do another 3 years and there will still be things that you could learn. Overall, the modules for the second year were definitely worth it, and I definitely got something out of each of them, even if I felt like some of them weren't particularly relevant to what I was doing specifically at the time. But the assessments this year were definitely a lot more difficult, and I felt like I was reasonably well prepared for my final year. Now, moving on to the final year, the big one, I headed into the year with quite a lot of optimism, especially with my final dissertation project. But unfortunately, this sort of motivation and optimism I had at the start of the year tailed off, as it did every year after you realise the amount of work that you need to do. You sort of head in with all this super amount of energy in September, but come sort of November, December time, you realise, oh crap, I've got all of this work to do, and then you sort of get overwhelmed with the amount of work that you have to do, and all that motivation and optimism sort of eventually dies down. But over the Christmas holidays and over the New Year period as well, something must have clicked in my head, and I must have had, I don't know how to describe it really, some sort of a epiphany. I know that sounds really spiritual and pretentious, but I can't really think of any other word for it. I think what had happened is I'd realised that this was my final chance to really put a lot of effort and put everything I had into my final year of education, because I'd spent the last 2.5 years at university putting in sort of a half-assed amount of effort, and then there was the previous 2 years of college where I'd only done, the bare minimum really, and then there was secondary school where I was just a normal teenager who couldn't really be asked for school, sort of doing the bare minimum to get a semi-decent grade. That's what I'd spent sort of most of my education doing, and then I'd realised this is the last time and probably the only chance I'm going to get to really put some effort into my education. So with that said, we'll move on to the modules that I had for my final year. And I want to start with professional development, as this was one of the reasons for my sudden change of mental state. That sounds a bit better than epiphany. This module was all about setting you up for the big wide world, getting us familiar with potential career paths that we could take, how to earn a living from music, but also how to manage yourself and combine your creative skills with the skills you sort of need to survive within the music industry. We were introduced to quite a few different books, occasionally each lecture being centered around a particular idea in a book, sort of these books being To Sell Is Human, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Getting Things Done, plus a few more sort of music business and music industry based books. But it was the lessons to do with self-management that really appealed to me and what I felt like I got most out of this module. The teacher was super enthusiastic about the whole subject as well, and I could really tell that he knew what he was talking about. And he taught it in a very fun and energetic way. Each of the 90-minute lessons or 90-minute lectures that we had, they were super high energy, super focused. There was music, videos, pictures. It was just a really sort of intense, full-on hour and a half. But what you got out of it was so much more than you would just sort of sat behind a computer, doing music for 2 hours. For the assessment for this module, we had to create a professional development plan that planned out either a real or hypothetical career path that we could take. But for this career plan, we had to do quite a good chunk of evaluating our own skills and then seeing where our skill set would be better suited. Looking back, this module plus my final dissertation were probably my favourite 2 modules out of the whole 3 years of the course. I think the telling thing here is that I probably put the most effort into these 2 modules, And these were the two modules that I probably got the most out of. If only I'd really sort of learnt this idea, 2.5 years before. I've put loads of effort into all of them. I would have got way more out of everything, but here we are. I've got my grade and there's nothing I can't really retake anything now, so. Audio post-production followed on from sound for moving image in the second year. Instead, this time we were looking at more dialogue and Foley for films rather than music. This was quite a difficult module, not really helped by the timetable that I had for it. I had this module at 5 p.m. until 8 p.m. and this was during the autumn and winter terms. So at some point I was going to university in the dark. I was leaving my house at 4 o'clock and it was dark. And then I was coming home again in the dark, which wasn't particularly motivating. But the work itself was really quite challenging. Everything was done again in Pro Tools and it was much more about being technical and precise rather than being creative. It was very interesting learning about how overdubs work and how to sync it to video. The part about creating Foley was very creative and fun, but the process of syncing it up to video and making it sound authentic was quite laborious at times. Interesting, but very challenging overall. Computer music design was probably the most fascinating modules out of everything that I did over the 3 years. We were looking at a program called Max, which you can use to build and program literally any sort of video, audio or visual program. So from basic reverb effects to specific sequences that interact with visuals or to full-blown art installations. It was amazing to sort of break down a synthesizer and actually work out what is required to shape and create sound, and then use sort of what you've learnt there and build each of the components and then route the signal correctly through each of the different areas, and then finally designing a user interface that the user can interact with well, whether you want to go for a traditional sort of user interface with everything there, or you want to go for something that requires video to interact with, or using unique ways, using unique inputs into the program to interact with things. For my assessment, I made a step sequencer where you can load in your own samples, program your own pattern, or randomly generate a pattern with a certain set of parameters that were controlling where and how much randomization was happening. If I had more time, I would be spending a lot more of my own time digging deeper into Max, because it's just such a vast and really powerful tool and program that you can use to, you can essentially create your entire studio within Max and then create your own music using your own virtual studio that you have built. Immersive Environments was quite a unique module. We were learning about music in the real world and how we can interact with it, or how it can interact with other things as well. The module itself was quite vague. I wasn't entirely sure what we were supposed to be learning about, but fortunately I found my idea for my immersive environment for the assessment quite early on and just got my head down and focused on that. Now I made a color synthesizer where you put different colors up in front of a video source, whether it be your webcam or an external camera, and then it identified how much red, green or blue was on the screen at once, and then it gave an average number for each amount of color, which was 0 to 255, and then I took that average number and converted it into frequency, so anything from taking a number from 0 to 255 and then scaling that number from 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz. Again, I used Max to program this as I was using it at the time for my other module, so I was feeling quite comfortable using Max to create this. It was fun making and building the project, but I wasn't completely sold on the module overall. Now for the big one, my final dissertation or production project as it was called at BIMM. Now rather than doing a 10,000 word research paper, we were required to record or produce 30 minutes of audio, then write a 4,000 word critical analysis of the whole project. To help us, we had to choose a supervisor who would help guide us through the module and help give us feedback and refine our idea. My project was a techno and house loop album, which was heavily inspired by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard's album Nonagon Infinity. Basically an album where each song overlaps and then the final track links back to the first track, therefore sort of creating an infinite loop of music. It's a bit similar to a DJ mix where the DJs sort of play two songs at the same time and there's sort of a smooth transition from one to the other, and there's no there's no break in music, it just flows from one to the other. But instead of performing those transitions, I was creating them within my DAW. It was essentially a free-for-all in terms of what kind of brief you could set yourself. But we did have to pitch our project to our classmates and one of the tutors, and then get some feedback to make sure the project was viable and good enough to stretch over the 30 minutes. The whole process of this project was extremely enjoyable, and being guided by one of our supervisors certainly helped. And it was really good to get some objective feedback along the way as well. The 4,000-word critical analysis wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, because I covered so much in my project, ranging from the initial concept, then also researching some certain production techniques, and as well as how to master an album, and then as well talking about the good and the bad points of the project overall. And because I had so much to cover, I'm fairly sure I ended up cutting out like several paragraphs worth of writing because I had to stick to the 4,000 word count. I'm really glad this was my final project for the end of the 3 years, and I wasn't doing a more research-based assessment. Now, in short, my final year was exactly what I was hoping for. Genuinely challenging work, modules that really dive deep into the art and the science of music production. After all, I guess this is one of the advantages of doing a creative degree rather than something more academic, and a final project that combined a lot of my skills that I learned over the 3 years. My change of mindset over the Christmas holidays and New Year certainly helped me get my 2-1 grade, and also that coupled with the COVID-19 lockdown in the spring, meaning I basically had 2 whole months to do nothing other than my assessments with 0 distractions. Without the lockdown period, I'm not sure I would have done as well. Now, I just want to run over a couple of more non-academic points. Also, sorry if I keep sort of looking down as I'm sort of talking. I've got a script here that I'm really trying to stick to, so I make sure I get all of the points. Also, I'm not particularly used to doing a sort of piece to camera video like this, so yeah, excuse me if I seem a little bit amateur. So anyway, I'll start with the people at BIMM, and everyone I met there was super friendly, super approachable, both staff and the students. There was definitely a unique atmosphere about the place, something very different from sort of more traditional educational establishments. The only slight issue I had was that as a music producer studying music production, I felt like I'm just sort of speaking from my personal experience, but us music production producers, we didn't quite fit in with everyone else. Walking around the corridors, you'll see all the other musicians carrying their instrument, and everyone sort of looks like they got something to do with music. And then there's just us producers, mostly typical guys wearing jeans, trainers, and a hoodie. And our skill sets lie within the more technical realm of music. And then there's everyone else, all the other musicians, who are able to perform on stage and know sort of music theory and are able to sing. To me, at least, I couldn't really find anything or sort of that much in common with sort of all the other people on the other courses, apart from the fact that we were both studying music, which just sort of felt a little bit odd, as there was sort of this big group of musicians that was sort of taking, that was sort of like 3/4 of the people at BIMM, and then there was a sort of small portion of us music producers with completely different skills and completely different interests in music. Maybe it was just sort of a me thing, maybe it was only me that saw that, but talking to other students on some of the other courses, the only thing I could really find in common with other people was sort of day drinking at our local Wetherspoons in between lessons, not necessarily the music that we listened to. That leads me nicely onto my next point of networking, which is obviously such a crucial part to the success of anyone who wants to make it in the music industry, because as we all know, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Unfortunately, as a music producer with 0 proper musical knowledge, I found it quite difficult to interact with some of the other students. But because of this, I feel like I might have missed out on some potential contacts that could have led me to some more music opportunities. Whether it be running a studio session for a musician, or maybe DJing at someone's house party. Also, one of the appeals of BIMM itself is their tutors, and their tutors are still currently working in the music industry. So I was hoping there might have been some potential opportunities advertised by the tutors themselves, or maybe they had a connection with a company where they send 4 students to go and be their interns for a week or something like that. There were newsletters sent about placements and internships outside of BIMM, but there was never really any talk of them on the campus. Maybe I could have investigated them more, but as they were internships and placements, I didn't really want to take time away from my studies, especially as I already had a part-time job at the time anyway. So yeah, networking, there might have been something there, but it wasn't particularly clear and obvious, and I was certainly hoping for more. Considering they advertised a very high rate of employment in the industry for graduates, I was hoping there would have been a bit more of a push for actually getting employment, or pushing us to go and find employment, rather than just teaching us skills, actually checking in on us and saying, right, what are you doing in terms of postgraduate? Would have been nice to have a bit more interaction there with it, rather than just teaching us skills and then leaving us and expecting us to sort of make our own way. But I guess we can't really ignore the whole COVID situation right now. The whole music industry has been seeing such a massive change, so it's rather difficult to sort of find any job at the moment. So that's why I'm just assuming here that that any talk of jobs, placements, internships, whatever you want to call them, sort of for postgraduates, there wasn't really any talk of it, simply because there might not have been anything there. The facilities at BIMM, they were definitely very good, if not a bit small due to the size of the building. The flagship studio they had was a very nice live room and control room set up. The second studio was an all-in-one with a vocal booth in the room too. These rooms were great to work in. Both my studio engineering and studio production lessons were all in here. There were plenty of Mac suites as well, all coming with MIDI keyboards, except for one or two rooms which featured a push controller. If I was an Ableton guy, which I'm not, I'm a Logic guy, I would have loved to have access. I would have loved to have had access to a push controller every day at university, but I'm not. I use Logic, so didn't really use the controllers. There was also more software than you could ever need as a music producer. We had the whole Native Instruments Complete, the FabFilter bundles, the Sound Toys bundles, plus a load more that I can't even remember, as well as being kitted out with a full Logic, Ableton Suite, Pro Tools, and quite a few others as well. Now, I don't know if this is still the case or not, but it probably is. But we got, each of us music production students got given our own copy of Ableton Suite. Compared to other universities with more physical space, I think BIMM does lack in this department, but it makes up for it in terms of the quality of the equipment, the software as well, and just the general whole technology thing that we had going on. It was really, really nice. I also forgot to mention the collection of hardware synths, Korg MS-20 Mini. We had a Dupfer modular system, Behring and DeepMind. I think it was the DeepMind 12, plus dozens of other bits of kit that I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but there was plenty of hardware to get your teeth stuck into as well. This leads nicely onto the campus itself. Yes, it was small, and in between lessons the front entrance did get crowded sometimes, and in today's COVID climate that could be a bit of a problem, but obviously for me it wasn't really an issue. There were plenty of smaller seminar rooms and a couple of live rooms which doubled up as lecture rooms as well. Looking back, it was quite cool to have our lectures in sort of a live, almost like a concert room basically. You're surrounded by the cool lighting, all the music equipment, rather than just a generic boring lecture hall. In terms of the social space, there's a small common room and a cafe. Some people also chose to socialise and talk to each other in the Mac suites, whilst everyone else had headphones on and was trying to work, which was very, very distracting quite often. So yeah, in terms of social space, there really wasn't that many areas and not much space. And the areas that they did have, the cafe or the common room, they were basically full all the time. Subsequently, the local Wetherspoons was most people's social hub, mine included. Beer, pub grub, and you're almost always going to bump into someone, one of your classmates or someone's friend of a friend you might briefly know. You're always going to bump into them when you're there. What's not to love, really? Many pints of 1.99 Dubar were drank during my time at BIMM, and I don't regret any of them. It did feel like a blessing in disguise that BIMM's small campus forced most of us people to go to the pub and socialise, because I had many a good time in that Wetherspoons in Fulham. One of the big appeals of BIMM London is London itself. Getting to live and study music in one of the music capitals of the world is a very, very attractive idea. I lived in a student studio flat in Acton and commuted about half an hour to get to Fulham, and then for my final year I moved to Ealing, and again with the same roughly half an hour commute. The issue with this though is most of my classmates and people I wanted to socialise with, they all lived in different parts of London, for example Dagenham, Camberwell, Southfields, Morden. This made it very difficult to meet your mate outside of class. It's not like you could just sort of call up your mate and just sort of go down to the local pub on a Friday night. You had to take the tube half an hour or so to meet somewhere, and then you've got to think about how you're going to get back, or how you're going to get back using the night tubes or the night bus, or if you're just going to crash at someone else's, and then in the morning have to spend half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour getting home in the morning. It always felt like a lot of effort or quite a big commitment to go out in London. because everyone was so spaced out. People do it, and I'm not saying that I never did it. I did it quite often, but had it been easier, had we all just sort of lived in a much smaller space, like for example, if in Bristol, if I decided to go to BIMM Bristol, Bristol's such a smaller city, it's probably much easier for BIMM Bristol students to get together on a Friday night, maybe go into a gig in Bristol city centre, and it's much easier for everyone to get there and for everyone to get home compared to London, where everything has the potential to be so much further away, and trying to get there can be a lot of effort. But to counter that, you're in London at the end of the day. There is always something to do if you don't want to socialise. You fancy a peaceful nature walk? There's an abundance of parks in London. Want to go to a museum? Exhibition Road. Want some cool street food? We'll head to Camden, Portobello Market or Borough Markets. They've all got you covered. And you should be really making the most of this whenever you're living in London studying, especially during your first year where the assessments are a little bit easier and there's a little bit less pressure on you. Go see all the museums, go see all the parks, go to all the gigs, go to all the bars and pubs. Yes, this can be quite an expensive thing to do, especially with the price of alcohol in London, and transport can potentially get a little bit pricey if you're heading into central London and going to concerts in central London or clubs in central London, and also entry tickets for some places can be quite pricey. But if you're smart with your money, don't buy takeaways every week, and you're vigilant when it comes to your sort of consumerism levels, it's very manageable and you really shouldn't be put off by the high rent prices. What you're paying that little bit extra for in London, you're getting back in simply what you can do, because there is simply so much to do in London. So then, to summarise, if you're a beginner to intermediate level music producer who is making music in their bedroom, uploading it to SoundCloud, and you want to learn more and take your music a little bit more seriously, then I can definitely recommend BIMM. But if you're a bit more established, you've had releases on labels and you're getting booked for gigs, not currently at the moment, if you were getting booked for gigs 6 months ago, then it probably isn't worth your time. Yes, you might learn some new things, but it's a massive time and financial commitment that will really kill any momentum you have as an artist. I found the first year quite frustrating, but someone who is a bit more of a beginner, that first year will be really good to learn all the basics and get you ready for your second and third years. Then the next years get progressively better as the work gets more challenging, as you get introduced to new ideas and techniques. Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell how good BIMM is when it comes to being a postgraduate, given the current climate and everything. But in terms of the pure learning of skills, it's good. How other universities compare, it's difficult to say, especially more traditional universities who have a music department rather than being a specialist organisation. But I imagine there isn't much of a difference, as the access to technology and knowledge of music production. But if you want a more unique experience, being at a smaller campus surrounded by like-minded musicians and sort of music-related people, then BIMM is definitely the place for you. Whereas if you want a more traditional university experience with doing the whole halls of residence thing, that's another thing BIMM doesn't have. BIMM doesn't do halls. Your accommodation, you've got to go and find it yourself. As I said, I lived in a independent student accommodation for my first 2 years, and then moved into my own flat with my girlfriend for the final year. But yeah, you've got everything yourself. BIMM will help you and assist you with setting up house shares and sort of pointing you in the right direction, but they don't specifically have a halls of residence. But if you want that traditional university halls experience and mixing with all the lots of other different people from the different courses, with who all have different nationalities, different interests, different specialist areas, all stuff like this, then BIMM might not be the place for you. Anyway, I think that's everything then. If you're looking to study at BIMM, I hope you learned something from this video. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll happily answer it. I thoroughly enjoyed my 3 years at BIMM, and I felt like I'm in a pretty good position now to answer any questions if you have any. And if you're looking to study, well, it'll be now 2021 now because you've all started. Probably a bit late for this video, but yeah, if you're looking to study in 2021 and you've got any questions, let me know down below. I studied music production, so I can assist with any music production related questions and any BIMM questions in general. Or if you studied at BIMM yourself, maybe you disagree with me, maybe you agree with me. I'd love to know. Anyway, I think that just about wraps this video up. I'll see you in the next video.